Part 3. Okay, fast forward the reel. Another place that the kids were taken to is called Cassville. This place was where the friendship tree was. This tree had about 5 huge trunk-looking growth limbs coming up out of it. So you could sit in it, you could hang on this tree. It looked really ancient, and it also reminded us of the Isle of Friendship that was played in the silent films. In a 1929 movie, The Devil in the Flesh. So this friendship tree was important. I could go back there, get total recall by touching it, other things like that, reminders, or it would just make you sad because you could remember all the things from way back by visiting certain parts of these sites, especially. Kind of like reminiscing of supernatural files, monster graveyards, and other secrets we kept about crafts, remote places, and then change that lingering desolation and abandonment feelings into transforming them into hope and change. Because I knew that my pieces were whole in God for the most part, but I wasn't sure if any of the others were, because sometimes we weren't all on the same page. And then we would be put into separate cars, get separated, and then we didn't know where each other was sometimes. So we'd stay at these little stone cabins also at that place. And then we'd also stay at these other cabins in Salem, Missouri. And that point was very strange because there would be directives and a green light that would come from the woods at night, like these green light flashes that would indicate different colored flashes would indicate different things, like what moves you would make in what situations. So you would wait there, and it was like another obstacle course, going through the creeks, going through different areas, getting to know the woods just like the back of your hand. You'd have to know them by. These were sometimes called night hunts, being chased by different creatures or beings that would just appear at bridges, other spots there along creek paths. And then this windy path would also go into a St. Jude's chapel, which looks like the 1700s pilgrims' stony cursed chapel that's just in the middle of the woods on a little stony path with a big statue of St. Jude in front of it and some flowers. And then a circular ring around that and a bench to sit on. A lot of these places are still under surveillance too. Roaring River was the name associated with Cassville named after Cass. And there's many caves at that places too. And one of these caves would go back into like a cleft of the rocks. And then you didn't know how deep it would go. And a lot of it was closed off from public view. There was also a place called Nathaniel Boone's Homestead, and then there was Defiance, Missouri, where a lot of the troops would gather back in the Civil War times, and then they'd get the troops all rallied up there. Nathaniel and Daniel Boone had an interesting relationship. Daniel Boone was more of a good guy, and Nathaniel Boone was a son that he had contended with that had been taken over. The man was pretty much reptilian, and his wife was insane. And what happens is that these interdimensionals look for top army ranking officials, people in positions of authority, to inhabit, to start taking over their minds, and then to start useless, gory events and chaos in fields at nighttime mainly, and try to change the timelines through that. We also witnessed these beings at Sulphur Springs. I was almost drowned by there, underneath this little stone outpost, and it's like an archway. They attempted to drown me here several times also, and at the current river Big Blue Round Springs under the SS Archway, Sulphur Springs. kind of like they just wanted to put you in a hidden tomb that was that arch, because at the time they were putting different stones on top of like a flooded area of this part of the river that went into a little dam area too. So then this SS branding came into play after this event, after choking and wrestling a lot in the water with these beings, having to fight like an SS to survive and to choose that way of life. Siloam, the Sulphur Springs also had the SS signature ingrained into it, and many other places too. 17.7 was also a number that was ingrained and encoded to some of us. Montauk State Park in Missouri was another place that came long before Montauk, Long Island, or Camp Hero came into play. So sometimes what we realized too is that starting at Montauk, Camp Hero, our memories started coming back and like reeling back and unraveling in a reverse pattern, starting from there for some reason and then going back to the beginning from that point, like going backwards. And then the werewolf experiences and all the night hunts and all the other things in between just kind of filed like overlapping folds that folded in on each other. But the psyche had to process things in a way that would be not all at once and in a gentle fashion, kind of like a ribbon folding in layers over on itself, because it's a delicate balance. So at the Montauk State Park, another association with MMM was that we had called the experiences there the Montauk Mill Monster. And we had dealt with unfavorable man that was inside of the mill. And that mill looked like something out of a horror movie too, of course. Fort Leonard Wood had several battles in that area too. Pea Ridge, other places with bunkers. A lot of these places became monstrous graveyards. These two white highway pillars were checkpoints in the time travel program that were around that area. And then you could also recognize other time travelers by their signatures. And then you could see more into the energetic and visible and non-visible light spectrums. EM waves to us kind of look like static fields and like a silver outline of static electricity and waveforms. Elijah McLean's house in Washington, Missouri also had left many awful battlefield remnants several times. And it wasn't just humans that were coming up from the Mississippi River from there. Because we were at that house before it even had additions added on to it, and became the mansion that it became. What we also did was we broke free from the blueprints of Hollywood before Hollywood came to be what it is today in existence, because they had to do beta testing with certain things to see what would work and what wouldn't work, with consciousness transfer, with body transfer, with different things, and in the silent film days in that era and that golden era, they did experiment with some early clones too. So you had to stop agreeing to any body swaps, clone acting, because the end game ultimately, of course, was just to sell your soul to the devil to become rich and famous. And we saw some people do that along the way. We also ran into a coven of the Daughters of Tabor in Arkansas and Pine Bluff that were selling their souls in the hopes of becoming famous. And then we saw what happened when a body, mind, soul, spirit engages in that process of becoming a reprobate, and how they come into certain places and certain clubs and then try to persuade everyone's mentality into like some sort of social acceptance into joining them. So it was kind of like glimpsing into hell and people leading people into that valley of the shadow of death and peering over into the pit. And with our consciousness, we viewed into many dimensions. But we also saw what sealed minds look like, those that are sealed in God. And then we also, on the reverse spin end of it saw what a seared consciousness, what a seared mind also looks like when the AI uploads them into this boxed in, sealed consciousness, cloud-like streaming for the kingdom of darkness, and then keeps them in that state. So then their body literally becomes this shell and an empty tomb. And Yahushua saw this when he told certain Sadducees that they were the children of the devil and whitewashed tombs on the inside, even though they had the appearance of trying to pretend that they were righteous or holy on the outside. He called them the seeds of the serpent. Because Yahweh cursed the serpent first, he told the serpent that there would be enmity between the serpent's seed and the Eve's seed. So you got to understand what the serpent's seed is and what Eve's seed is. He couldn't have said seed if the serpent didn't have any seed planted and sown into the garden already somehow. So this shape-shifting, genetic usurpation, manipulation, desecration, and defilement happened as an invasion of the garden. But back on par. Okay, so then there was another place called the Dreamland Theater Ballroom in Hot Springs, and Zacchaeus Ewing also was there. And this was a very bizarre place. You'd go to like the top levels, which were these boxed in balconies, and sit in these black chairs. Then you'd have handlers come up there. You'd look out these like ship-looking circular windows out into the city, and then be programmed in like this dreamlike spell. And then we just look over the top of the balcony over at other people's seats on the other side of the balcony, trying to remember who we were. So I didn't go along with this and resisted this very adamantly because I really knew what this place was all about from the get-go. And it was really trashy. So there was all these box balconies, a stage that just smelled very reptilian inside of the place. There's lots of plants, black and red curtains hanging down everywhere. It's like the same type of thing at each one of these places. The female draconian matriarch would try to do this type of mind corruption on stage. She would run the place. Basically, it was a ritual center. The 12 daughters of Tabor were into high magic, indoctrination through Freemasonry, and their husbands, fathers, relatives were all in this league in dark arts too, because they were brought up to think this way. And so their symbol stone was on the outside of this building, and it had an eye on it, and the numbers 777333 outside as this ancient order, marking their territory. So their plays were depicting like the voice of God coming out, V2K before that came out. It wasn't God's voice, though, of course. It was just this person on stage that the enemy was speaking through, saying he came from Mount Tabor. So there's many false signs and wonders, many false promises that come from these people, appealing things that they try to get you to appeal to and participate in. If you, but they always have to agree to the enemy's demands and give in to the allurements. Many of these theaters also have the pan screaming faces on them with the tongue sticking out of the walls, or chains coming out of animals' mouths, holding them into the stone and stuff. And this was also used for programming. Pan is very common in these occult-oriented theaters because before Hollywood, they had to use the theaters and the theater rings. So you'd have to mentally fight in this interactive design, ritualistic drama that was no play or music show, but it was just kind of purely aimed at entrapments and enslavement to their ancient order of Freemasonry. Because I saw many MK victims actually sitting up by the windows, those little circular windows, and sealing their deals with a kiss in front of the circle windows. They later made a couple kissing as this like cardboard black figure that was the symbol for the theater too. So the headmistress some of the kids there ended up getting in a fight with. Many kids broke free from their programming. They didn't go back there again. And the place is still kind of a very ruined place. Then there was also the Sanger Theater in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And this place was a very, very tall building, a den of filth, though, and iniquity. You could also smell the reptilians when you walked in there. There was huge green plants in the entrance, black and red curtains everywhere again, same colors, same patterns adorning the place in every room. There's a big old elevator next to this big red brick wall. We ended up setting some of the trafficked kids free there. There was doors in the floorboards and spaces and hidden doors that we had pulled apart and made known and taken pictures of everything. The place ended up getting just destroyed. The elevator came crashing down. The theater was torn up, even the curtains. There's holes in the walls, huge holes in the ceilings, water coming through the ceilings, many statues and symbols knocked down, strongholds broken. A lot of the kids broke free from the trances and forced acting feats. These rooms were like literally rotting at the end with decay because the paint was red, but then it was all bloody looking paint peeling off the walls at the end. And the same thing happened in the Fox Theater blowout in Chicago. And there was interdimensional scaling the walls inside of that theater. And the theater got ultimately destroyed, as well as their secret doors, their books, their pictures, entryways, exits, everything got torn up and uncovered for the world to see in a time-released, safe manner, of course. What was hidden inside the brick walls, pictures, evidence strewn about. Because a lot of these places had draconian operators. Their costumes were also torn up. Their occultic scepters, their tools, their devices, scripts burned. Sometimes we even took jewelry from these places, rings that were used for trances, things like that. Enchanted objects, cursed objects. So after all this went down, we never wanted to actually look at a theater again, or pictures, or words of even actors that were written on the wall. That place's connecting point was New Orleans. So we got our bearings back from a lot of these theaters over time. We learned a lot about word magic there, about twisting of the original words of God through these experiences, what these cults do, the common through line that runs through all cult activity, the tidbits of how they like take the tidbits of the actual word of God that just suits them or for their agenda, and then how they spin it into a lie and weave it into an agenda or an indoctrination, and then eventually a mind trap, because then you get into a mind prison and you're not growing at that point, and your soul isn't growing. Later on in these days, me and John were fighting tech that tried to trap us into different bodies, to agree to promote Disney's illusions, made videos basically propping up Disney. Then the whole Route 66, a lot of points in there happened. That place where they had the 12 apostle statues meeting fallen angels there, which became like Clash of the Titans. When those fallen angels showed up from the stars, it was like they were trying to lull us into their minds when we saw them appear inside the hollow statues. We were being taken around and driven around in different vehicles at this point. We even had needle marks in our arms. And we were the most powerful, of course, in our original bodies. So when we looked down and realized this, then we all came together mentally and could be stronger. One trick that we learned in this process was that a clone body doesn't have blood that speaks to you, because your blood is the life, your blood is alive. In your own body, you can put your ear to your own blood and hear your blood. In a clone body, it doesn't have the same type of vibration with that and the same type of harmony. So we'd put our arms together, kind of like the Power Rangers, and, and realize if we were in our real bodies or not. And if we were, then we would come together more strongly and be more shielded. So we were standing at the bottom of this mockery of the Last Supper in the middle of a desert. In the background, you could see this black cross that was blasphemous. We could see the devil behind that cross hiding. I felt like my knees were going to buckle in. I was just shaking. I called out to Jesus Christ. We felt his presence there, like a good shepherd's hand shows up and protects his children from this nightmare. We broke free from this type of synthetic looking realm. We heard our own blood speaking to us. We got back into our own power. The Lord heard the life in our blood. And then the fallen angels disengaged from the statues and went back up into the sky. Because our blood is like Abel's blood that called out in the ground when he was killed, and the Lord heard his blood crying out to him. And even the earth wouldn't receive Abel's blood because he was innocent. And the earth literally kept spitting Abel back up. So our blood has like this light filament and element to it, and a spark and almost a luminescence to it, and that you can see with spiritual eyes. So even if you were drugged, you could peer into your own flesh and recognize yourself, recognize your soul, recognize your spirit. The hybridization program with creatures, chimeras, and things like that is an abomination, because the spirit and soul mixed with like an animal nefesh doesn't recognize itself. So we were the most powerful in our original forms, bodies, our blueprints that we carried over for so long at this point. And it's why the attacks on our bodies could be so detrimental if we lost the discernment to know the difference. So the tangible bodies of ours carried a lot of our cellular blueprint meshed into each person's soul matrix, because we each have one of those. And being focused to operate in your own flesh was kind of like an anchor point, an advantage that you had the ability to become fully alive in and fully engaged in and fully charged in when you are in the eyes fully sold, single soul occupancy. You get like fully charged like a battery, because in that state you have the potential in the body that you're given to become incorruptible. That potential of incorruptibility is built right into our cells. And for certain moments, it's like God opens up like fire letters inside of us or in our DNA to activate a little glimpse of a much fuller potential that the Elohim operates on and sits on. So when we get into these high-level spiritual states, it was very beautiful. It was blissful, even though it was hard work. John sometimes had part of his mind back in the AI, back in Program Lucid. So he could eject out of his body very easily and use it as like a type of escapism. And he didn't recognize himself sometimes or others to know if he was dreaming or if it was a real situation. So he would cause schisms and a lot of disturbances and a lot of fights in a lot of situations where people had to rebuke him and have him get out of their space, because he was a liability because the AI would try to piggyback through him to get information about all the other children in this program through our consciousnesses. So you couldn't have this type of instability running around, because it was like a house of dominoes, a delicate house of cards that that would fall down if everybody wasn't working together as a team. And you couldn't be in like a mental fog. And you couldn't let your energy get drained. I mean, sometimes it happened, yes, but you couldn't let it get drained to a certain point where you couldn't return back to. So a lot of the kids ended up not remembering who John was, shutting themselves off from him to shut down the AI that was operating through him. Because you can enmesh with some of these AI interfaces like Project Lucid that can become like fried parts of yourself constituently. Because its main objective is to make you believe your own lies, stay there, believe its lies, perpetuate it while you accept being a victim in it, as it lures you into its tentacles to stay and feed off of you above all things. And then it creates in you major illusions and delusions, senses of false pride, delusions of grandeur, making your own reality while it's just using you as like a feeding port. So some of the kids were used for astral jumping. They were very hypnotized. Then they couldn't tell the focal points, differences between certain organic and false things. Some of the kids got so good at this that they could go into a vehicle, hijack a body, and then try to cause a car crash or collision. And then right before the car was going to collide, they would eject out of the body. So that was called body hijacking. They wanted to use individuals with that ability and other skill sets like that. So over time, he ended up getting mixed and blended in others' imaginations and creativity with his own, because it steals creativity. So Project Lucid ran like a parasitic program. It would try to make you forget your own face, everyone else's face, your real identity, to hide behind other faces and consciousness streams, interfaces that aren't even your own, to try to peer through somebody else's eyes, see through their environment, try to see through their body, basically. And why it did this is to get you to do it so much that you couldn't recognize things for what they really were, and the higher truth, God's voice, not being able to differentiate between AI from a real angel or one that is a fallen one. So Lucid operated like a hive mind parasite, projecting itself into others, making them get lost in imaginations. The AI scans children's dreams, and it does that on the spaceships. It did that on WArden. And then sometimes it's hard to hide information from it when it would do that. So some of the kids were used by Lucid to report back to Lucid and view other streams of consciousness. So we called him an unfriendly Casper the Ghost, like a lucid parasite that you didn't want standing behind you or viewing things from your perspective, because he would steal them and feed it into the AI. At first, we understood that some kids made decisions like this to like briefly hide themselves. To get endurance, to go into sleep states. But then sometimes what would happen is that a kid would go into like a spiritual coma, and then they would get stuck in there. And that wasn't beneficial for anybody. So trust was something that was constantly Breach, something that kept getting broken between members of our group, others not being resilient but malleable, instead becoming like a predator type weakness. Things like that to see were hard to see. I would have to tell and remind the other kids to stay in their bodies because escapism was one outlet that some of the kids took instead of holding the course and holding memories and getting through certain missions and assignments. Because a lot of the stained glass windows, a lot of the fragmentation, a lot of the personality stuff came through a lot of artwork, a lot of statues, a lot of stained glass windows that they wanted the characters that were in the windows to become like embedded in you, overriding your identity and soul memory makeup. Some of the kids would collapse when they were forced to stand in front of these windows in certain places. They're trying hard not to lose soul memory that they were tied together so strongly into initially. It's like an original blueprint inside of you that gets marked up, torn, and rearranged so it doesn't look the same, to be able to recognize it. When you look, so what John ended up doing was playing this like jackalope game of Catch Me If You Can, like Blade Runner. And these beings want you to take all the distractionary routes, to not be a straight shooter, to not be upright. They want your mind to be so far gone, so far stretched that you accept their greatest lie, which is that you are too far gone for God to forgive you and to come back to him. So we lost a lot of kids just through them being messed with by AI. And some of the kids became almost like skinwalkers themselves because they became just like the AI, thinking that their abilities were special and that they could do these things, and the bodies that they were doing them to didn't matter. Whatever things they told themselves to justify the things that they were doing was still wrong. It was hard to watch. It was exhausting to try to get some of the kids to realize what they were doing and how it went against our soul mission and created this friction, because they would become a weak link in this aspect when they did that. And if you can't be comfortable in your own skin, then what they did was cop out to resorting to like a fantasy type world, because that fantasy world needs you to project it out. And it's what Project Lucid was all about. And its remnants are still doing the same thing to many celebrities, the celebrities that are walking in clone bodies to this day. But despite all that Lucid did, Yahushua delivered us, set us free from the desert demons, fallen angel event, paralyzation. They retreated at his rebuke through us. Our bodies were freed. Our minds were focused. We had clarity. We had sharpness, coming back fully into the moment. The Grigori left the cloak-veiled art sculptures like transformers back to the void where they belong. Dust in the wind. They hightailed it out of there, because they'll be like the dust that never evolves into anything, and the wind that's blown in a lost desert sand that is eaten by the serpent, as Revelation states. But in that moment in the desert, I knew that my Heavenly Father was a giant bigger than them, as intimidating as they were looking down at us with their eyes, like we were like little ants to them. What they were portraying was just jealousy and hatred through their veil. Even though they were once sons of God, they were nothing more than, now they're nothing more than kindling wood for the fires of Gehenna. So they just try to take cheap shots at the children of the Most High. So they're scanning and searching every day for bodies, looking for soul signatures to tempt. to give into their side. Okay, so you had to keep your timeline streams straight, get the downloads to the rest of everybody sometimes, stay on course. What we were reminded of too is that we could not let our sins pile up so much that you had to dig your way back out of it, because the rest of the group would collapse like a house of cards. You had to keep this like integral level, a certain amount of integrity to be able to stay active and to stay successful through these situations. You couldn't allow lies to perpetuate and infiltrate your vain imagination to interfere with higher plans. So what happens here on earth is like a sifting and a sorting of loyalties of the hearts and souls of men. What we're made up of, what we're composed of, what our soul's capacity is and our personalities come into, what we can handle. And we're never given more than what we can handle. And that fire of free will blazes in heaven. And when we passed a hard encounter, we would have an angel talk to us sometimes that would actually brief us, show us what we did wrong, what we did right, how to do better next time, what to do next, what the lessons were. And what this angel did at one point after the Carson Mansion in Eureka was she showed us this net, and that if we became too dirty, just like the parable of the fish, we couldn't pass through the net to be kept as good and usable, but would be thrown back and have to endure something far worse for eternity than even all the evils that we had already seen. So that was a big reality check. And then we became very self-critical, knowing that we couldn't let our sins pile up too high, or you couldn't complete your mission here. And it was like a remembrance and a nagging in your soul and spirit that you had to continually be washed clean, how to stay as one of the good fish that the master would look at and keep when all souls are collected at the shores in the end. Because Yahushua, he sees all, he knows each one of us intricately as he walks on the vaults of heaven and looks at us each day. That's like a molten mirror. And when we gaze into him, meditating on understanding his heart and mind, he's gazing back at us, responding, even if we don't feel it in a big way sometimes. Because what comes off of him and just his eyes are these waves. And the waves are way more powerful than any of the ocean's waves, even. The energy that comes through him and from him. Because he's the creator of this universe. And he knows who loves him and who doesn't. And that comes down to obeying and following the way. So angels go through the same door, the Savior, that humans do. Angels are judged too. Every thought in one's heart is the same as doing the act. So the fallen ones knew that we'd be judged by the inclinations and imaginations of our heart when God looks into them. And they used our own imaginations and lucid and other attempts as a way to stockpile your sins against you. And illusions like that, oh, it didn't matter, or it wasn't real, or whatever excuses that they made, laughing at us the whole time behind our backs. Because they know that a high vibrational soul can interject into a body, do certain deeds or missions, and then eject out. And they know what we're capable of doing. So they test the limits of all that. And what happened in Corinth in the Bible was the same level of ideology, that it's just all spirit. But the word says that all deeds done in the flesh will be judged. We're to be in this world, but not of this world. Corinth people believed that the flesh didn't matter, when in fact everything about the flesh and everything about our own nature comes from the evil from the flesh that needs to be mastered and overcome to be able to walk in the spirit and master the flesh and not have the carnal mind, the carnal spirit of the mind, but a renewal of the spirit of our minds, and to operate in kingdom authority. So we crucify the flesh every day to have that type of mastery here. The spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. And that's why clone centers and clone tricks, all the things with the Clone Wars, a lot of it just comes from the Kingdom of Darkness and the cloning dynamics and all the dead energy and compartmentalization that comes from these things, not being able to have all the higher spiritual faculties at play when something or technology is trying to pull you out of your body at tandem and box you into things and get you stuck into one dense form into another dense form, so that you're continually feeding off the flesh of the beast and not being remade into a new creature every day by submitting and yielding to the will of the Most High and just walking in that oneness of being with Him. So a lot of kids went into amnesia. It's like they had major spiritual amnesia. But sometimes it was to protect their soul compartmentalization process for their own survival, defense mechanisms built into them, and to preserve the survival of the Great Awakening and work to come, because we could see into future timelines, into future end events to come. So after an event was won, our bodies felt like they sometimes were falling apart or dying, and you could get very emotionally, psychologically, mentally, spiritually, and physically healed too, to be processed and ready to jump again, because these kids and us were translated in time several times. The whole thing with Disney was that Walt Disney's parents had an SRA barn that he grew up viewing. And it was just in the middle of nowhere, Marceline, next to this red house. He would go sit under a dreaming tree to get away, but eventually was overtaken by this darkness. And we later went in to document the area, leave a trail for us to come back to. What happened is that I went into the place, and there was already a person that was sitting inside of the barn. Like, they were just waiting for me. This person just looked exactly like Bush Jr. at first. Then he stands up, casts a huge shadow on the wall. I jumped back, and I saw this being come closer to me, but had this morphed out face already, and these wings coming out of its back that were black wings, and its face was with like this hatred and loneliness that represented like a kaleidoscope of void spaces, like pocket dimensions that were tormenting its every angle that its eyes looked into. So what this thing really was it was a morphed out satanic four-faced Mickey Mouse head with a man's face, a fallen angel's face, and then a faceless face, I guess nothing face, and then a beak coming out of it. So this four-faced fallen angel had fully manifested in front of me, calling itself Marceline, which was actually the entity Mickey Mouse's real name, in fact. So it appeared to Walt Disney as a kid with pointy ears instead of the round ones that we see today. And it's actually an African demon. And his parents would string up the kids on a rope to this tall fallen angel giant in the barn that they were sacrificed to. So it just wanted to have more children in the barn. And we were sent back there to make it look like it was like this publicly visited, popular place, instead of what it really was, which was just some creepy ass little trail in the middle of the nowhere with Satanists guarding it in a red house. So after contending with this entity that seemed to be just, nonchalantly waiting in a rocking chair for me, like it was happy it had gotten there first, and could travel faster than me in this supernatural super soldier highway trip from hell, I ended up just booking it out the door, running down the trail past the mirrors on the outside of this barn, and was kind of shaking and out of breath. John and I went back in there later, and we painted our handprints on the wall and left papers out, exposing this place for what it was, hoping that maybe somebody someday would find it. But I don't know how far the information spread. Another barn that was very much like this was in Springdale, and this was the Shiloh barn. And many men from the mills at this time period were leaders of cults, and their mills were all getting burned down in this town. One of the barns had like this steel circular swinging wheel that was on top of it coming out of the barn window door. And they were sacrificing cattle and hanging them there and doing other types of hangings from this barn. And when the main man, who looked like this like beady-eyed albino, was dealt with in the end in front of this barn, that barn was also no longer able to harvest such mass amounts of energy. And some of these towns would actually take apart buildings like this, like sacrificial barns or sacrificial structures, and then make them into a public museum or display, like some sort of satanically infused structures were the town's most prized possession or something. It was crazy. Sometimes, like I said, in the public center of the town would be like the Claven leader's grave. They would make effigies on their own and then surround things with this, with certain notorious outlaws throughout Route 66, and just marked their graves. But nowadays, this energy harvesting and ritual center is more dependent, I would say, on nanotech and others' bodies and nanotech flesh of the beast, creating a link with it versus these old types and ways of doing the ancient raw ritual energy grabs and bringing ancient creatures into the situation. And Frank Lloyd Wright and Getty were also working together and had underground labyrinths. And Frank Lloyd Wright has a lot of symbolism in his house, a 30-foot black statue of Pan at the Talesian place. There's many mysterious and gruesome violent murders associated with a lot of their houses. They were both very creepy old men involved in these gangs with their suits and their hats and their canes. Frank Lloyd Wright was basically the blueprint worker. He would make the architectural designs to build these houses, build the structures, and then Getty and the other people would come in and then use the places for ritual sites. So even today, in modern today, like even the machines they have now and build up like CERN, still don't harvest and gather the peak amounts of energy that they need to open these old types of portals that these types of children came in to deal with that level of evil and close all those gateways, close all those portals, close all those doors. A lot of it was done in the early 1900s, and their plans were halted because everything has to be done at the summation and the final endpoints of this world being brought into its full measures in God's timing, in the Lord's timing, where the final beast system's mouth is fully shut and it can't speak blasphemies anymore against the Most High, where it'll be put out of commission and put on a shelf. Sometimes we would have short assignments to come into certain areas to deal with certain men, certain people that we could see into, like they were interdimensionals in like a couple men's bodies or something. You could see through them, see what their spirits were. But little did these beings know, because they're so puffed up with their knowledge and pride, that that sometimes a little child's body was actually a trap for them. It's Mineral County. That place is also rich with occultic workings, energy harvesting from the Department of Energy's wings. That's part of it is also taken over and compromised, working with fallen angels, a faction of that. We're actually chased off the grounds there by a man. And we also had a few male handlers there. We'd see things coming up out of the lake. We actually saw like a water snake come out of the salty lake. And there was also tunnels connecting to this lake from certain facilities because they use the Marine Kingdom a lot for opening portals. And then we kind of at that moment got like a final glimpse of what it would be like to see the final battle with Leviathan. This town seemed to be kind of like under like a cloak, under like a little spell, but it was overlaid with serpent worship, because everywhere there was pictures and mottos that said like serpent pride and pictures of serpents everywhere. So this energy was being generated from deep within the lake and funneled through that area, through machines. They also had local dragon festivals throughout the year. So we knew that that would be an X area in the future where a major final battle would probably take place too. So we did what we could there, but it was heavily armed, guarded, secured, a secret place that we managed to fight, not getting ourselves energy harvest into and trapped into forever. All right, so I mentioned St. Jude's Church, Montauk State Park, Mill Monster, Missouri. Lumber barons. What really happened at the Carson Mansion had to do with the Fourth Reich. The lumber barons their prestige attracted the attention and coveting factors of the Nazis that reached their ocean shores. So the Nazis ended up landing in that place, enslaving the banker elites that were there, taking over the most expensive mansions in that area, and then made the kids that were there in the mansion basically their slaves. They had to make them drinks in the parlor. The Nazis would play cards, have talks, just run the whole town basically at that time. The stairs that would go up to the very top levels just felt like sinking sand. Kids were taken into bedrooms, tied up with ropes. This place was also one of many morgue cycles of trafficking kids in and out of it systematically. So what we would do is we'd sit in the upstairs hallway, and that hallway was called the time tunnel. And then you would sit and wait for your name to be called while there would be a Nazi in the office. And then you'd be called into there, and then your whole reality would be changed and shifted into something entirely different. It was very challenging, very nerve-wracking, and very mind-blowing in a heartbeat because of how fast things could shift and the technology that they had in their hands. Because the stained glass windows themselves would change with the time tech into different scenes and different colors even. So nothing really seemed to stay the same. The mansion itself seemed to be almost alive and changing colors too. It was just ornate, full of all these scales on the outside of it, dragon symbols, dragon entities, kind of like breathing out through snake worship, Black Thule Society worship that was infesting every pore and corridor of this mansion, inside and out, inside this place, even in the chandeliers. I mean, it was everywhere. One of the closets in the end of the hallways, again, that looked like a Harry Potter house hallway, had the steel cage inside of it. So there was what ended up being on the outside of this door was a bunch of claw marks from the kids going in and out of there and fighting with this Nazi Draco possessed man in there in uniform. Sometimes we could grab weapons against them, sometimes we couldn't. But you just always had to protect your neck in whatever situation that you dealt with these things. When you come into the mansion, you would see a huge man sitting in a chair that was like 12 feet tall, with a mirror that was way high above the chair. So they do a lot of mirror magic on the kids, a lot of things they try to entrance the kids with through their eyes and through mirrors. This chair looked like it was built for a giant, and the guy would just stand up from the chair, try to intimidate the kids right away, make them feel really small. A lot of the kids didn't buckle, no matter how many kids were dragged up or down the stairs or threatened. You could see different reflections in the mirrors in certain games that were going to be played, certain shadow forms, I guess, to know what was going to happen. Their world was this illusion that was soon to collapse. So I just held on to that hope after each game, each attack, each day, and as each week went by. because they could hold you up like 10 feet in the air. So you had to be on your guard. The Nazis would take the kids to the banks, which looked like it had red blood dripping on the outside of it because it was like red lines and paint dripping on the outside of this white bank, and it was fringed with gold. They had a lot of gold inside of the bank that they were having stacked, having shuffled around, being put in ships, being transported to different places. So their empire was basically being nested and built there for a certain amount of time. And then this house would just glow from the sun. But what they were doing is you could see the black sun energy and sun energy being siphoned into this house's portals and being reflected off of it like wheels and spokes of energy. So then we'd be taken up onto the porch, different steps, offered different things to join them. A lot of them would be wearing the big black rimmed hats and the big black trench coats and boots. And they would actually light candles for you before you would come in the house to enter, to make you feel like you were guests of honor, privileged enough to do their stupid Ingomar play. And then through the play, you would be conditioned to accept the scripts and the satanic alley scripted lines that they wanted you to speak on stage for them. And then live torture of children, of course, on stage. So there was another red room in this mansion. It had a lady statue in it, which represented a real woman. And there was a sun stained glass window above her head, above this throne that she would sit in. And then she would... you could see the black sun worship coming through the window portal, and the person sitting on the throne would change. What she would do is she would have a bowl of water that she would hold in her hand, and dust sometimes too. Much like in the Mark Twain cave, they had the bowl of red water that would turn into ash or dust with the Skeksis. So this woman would want you to look in the water. Stephen's room there had more... that was more like psi attacks in there. There was another woman where I fought a woman that was in this like sitting room. I broke free from her mind control and grabbed a hold of a rope, kind of like those theater ropes that just kind of keep people in line. They had the kids under such mind control that they could actually just put like a rope that was used in like a theater, and then tell them to stay there, and they would. So some kids were compliant, some kids weren't. You would have windows of opportunity to loosen their leash and be able to break for your attack at times when they were least expecting it, and then break any mental links. So the Nazis made you take like pictures outside on the porch, and what you would see in like the main head one was like an archdemon officer type character in him. He was in a suit smiling at us. We were just very drained. And he took a picture to make us look like a normal family sitting on the porch, but nobody was smiling. And in that moment, we did feel defeated. The kids would try to like communicate with their dogs, to never take anything that was offered to them, especially candy, in the dining room. Their insults just continued to get worse over time, I would say. The tech was very abrasive. And then they would take you to a room upstairs in the time tunnel hallway to be transported into a guillotine room. Okay, and in this area is where the 3 top Nazi headhunters were. These people were also not just in history Hitler's top 3 headhunters. They were also time terrorists and time travelers and time transporters. So these 3 main men were in the top hats. They were soul hunters, soul stalkers, the 3 main ones at the time. And they would make you feel very nauseous just being in their presence. Their black sun energy was just very sickening. So you'd be threatened in the guillotine room that they had used so many times for beheading whomever they wanted to that didn't fit their regime. They beheaded thousands of people with these guillotines. They decapitated many people, and they actually made lambskins out of people's skin. and wanted the Skinner families to do that same sort of continuous work. Skinner being a name in X-Files. These people were um, monsters among men. So they just candidly speak and smile to you like they had full control and were so pompous. It was a very hard time for everyone in the group, and very confusing with shifting time windows and all the doors, rooms, memory erasures, altars that were in this time period. So then you'd have brief windows of opportunity to communicate, like sitting in benches in hallways or between missions and stations, and being shuffled around. But you knew that you were always being watched. I was usually in a red dress most of the time and had a hairstyle. A lot of times it was like a 1920s, 1930s hairstyle. There was a crippled boy on the porch. His legs weren't functioning very well. His legs were very wobbly, and he was walking on the porch area. Some of the kids that came in for this mission actually could embody like a weak person like this and try to help them. But I found this very hard to handle because my body couldn't operate as effectively as a fighter in a very weakened, frail form like that. Because this crippled boy's ankle kept giving out. He had this wooden handcrafted support shoe that was not very good, but it was, I guess, the best in that time period. So the Nazis, of course, are dominant and they pick on the weakest one. So they were picking on this boy and ended up getting more and more brutal to this boy. And it was very heart-wrenching to watch, especially when they would trip him on the porch in front of us. Our soul family was together at this time, embodied in this family. They're balancing out the work at hand. And it's just what the Black Sun worshippers do. They come in to steal, kill, and destroy. So then there was a soul that came in, whose name was Baron, and he came into this boy's little frail body that was very weak and offered to do that for us to continue our mission. And what this did is it gave us more reason to stay and do what we came there to do. And if somebody has a martyr soul like that, it's very inspiring, because for the sake of one sheep, it helps you stay to carry that sheep like a good shepherd into like a more promising hope and better shores. Because when you looked out at the shores of Eureka at the time period, they were very bleak. They were very dismal. So when somebody came in and did some selfless act like that, to be just in the hands of Nazis, it was very eye-opening. These people, they had cars, objects, ships, all that they had collected and hoarded. We just did not want that to be any part of this reality. So what ended up happening is they ended up beheading this little crippled boy that couldn't walk on the porch. And it was very crippling to witness. So these lords and these barons, these elite bankers that the Nazis had enslaved, they actually had up in a red tower that was downtown. Those two main guys ended up getting freed, whose banks they took. And at that point, those elite bankers could have chose the way of truth and freedom and liberty, but they decided to choose and continue in the path of slavery and revenge, and then just to become just as bad as what the Nazis were, and to choose that path of inflicting other souls. And then they tried to enslave the remainder of the kids that were there in the town. So they really didn't learn much of a lesson or have much gratitude and gratefulness for being set free out of that jail and that tower. So there's different like rules of engagement with a lot of these events that transpired in the Time Wars. So certain quirks happened that were nice, helped us know how to gain a better footing. Okay, so I think I'll go to a different spot. There was another area that was a place that looked like a castle. This place had like a white tower peak on it. Um, this place, we ended up at the end labeling it, I guess, in the Time War diaries as the cattle eaters, because a lot of cattle, a lot of horses were disappearing in this area. And in the end, we just saw like hundreds and thousands of them and knew that they were being stockpiled and disappearing. They were actually buried in big mounds after mass consumption of them. This building that we had encounters with interdimensionals was a medical facility, which is now a federal facility that's mentioned on the blacklist. And it had this labyrinth court built into its structures and many towers around it, many watchtowers. You could see tower lights from far away. Lightning eventually split the roads that were built into this area, just split them in many, many pieces. Some of the kids had major interdimensional fights in this area. They were smashing their fists into the ground like hulks. Vehicles were trying to run them over. Other types of physical and dimensional warfare occurred there. There were fences built of this big sharp stone, wood and mud like all meshed together, and little creeks running through the whole area. There was like a running track and a loop around this place, and then a main facility, and 17 houses built around this medical prison's courtyards. So now only 4 houses are left. A lot of the houses got burned down. A lot of that is a result of fallen angel black firefights and other destruction that went on and covert ops. One of the houses that was white that had lanterns hanging on it was run by a very wicked slave-owning, trafficking baron, slave trader of children too, and a pedivore. There was people in the basement. A lot of people got freed from this place. So it's kind of like an infirmary type neighborhood is what it ended up feeling like at the end. Another man we ended up following back to a farm. We saw some of these people actually take some of the cattle out of the barn and the horses and feed off of them, even in broad daylight. So we ended up just calling them the cattle eaters. Another, I guess you would call it type of gang, we just called Red. A lot of these people involved in this circle loop were very high level Freemason Satanists. They would have shadows of bats come off their heads, like a bat would fly off their head. Their teeth would get sharp for a second. And then they had like supersonic hearing, like a cybernetic tech inside of their head. Or you could call some of these characters the Satin Joker too. A lot of them wear white gloves. They take pictures of their crimes with like old Polaroid cameras they had. So different things would appear, and we would have to neutralize certain new elements, certain frequencies, break free of new silence, new formations, jamming signals. We hear like bat-like sharp sounds even, and see place to place to place, like a soul hunter, a soul stalker. And it ended up being the same entity from the vampiric house that was next to the Two Sons campground by Noel. So what these people did is they set up big black crosses in town with the word giant on them. They didn't use the whole word hamburger because the message was cryptic, and they wanted to call the big red building by this character's house, Redberg's Castle, meaning a fortress. And that's what Hamburg means. And it has a German connotation to it, too. This man set up the first drive-through window at this like decaying house that had vines growing all over it through a window in the kitchen. It was very dark in the kitchen, and it had this like musty cellar smell to it. This man's wife was terrified of him. He had a pond in the backyard that was all fenced off. Many animals were killed in the back, their blood drained continually. There was a car graveyard that went on for miles in the back that was also blocked off from public view. They would just throw rocks over certain areas, bury certain things, build walls around things and mounds to cover up carcasses and other things. These people were blood eaters. So they told the public the special ingredient in the hamburgers that they were making was meat from kidney fat that they had fried the food in. But what the meat was really composed of was much grosser than that, and it contained adrenochrome that was added to it daily. So when me and John looked at this, we were very appalled, and we just couldn't understand how people could have such little discernment to know that they had been eating satanically infused bloody burgers with an old man who had a creepy smile on his face while he handed it to you. So we refused to eat them. I mean, we would take, if there was an ultimatum, like we would take the drugs instead of even touching that meat. And if we did come in contact to it, we would try to puke it up when we would leave the area. And it made everyone who ate it very mean, very angry, and especially the people who ran the medical facility next door. So at night, they would have night hunts in this place through the car graveyards with all the old school black cars and the long, tall grass areas into other business sectors, junkyards. It was an old school system, and even had a communications building next door. We would have flashlights on the trails. Me and John would split up. He'd pop up in different areas of the perimeter and then out a different trail and exit that we would plan on. So they would just use different cars, dispose them, auction some off. And it was like an old secret unknown faction of intelligence that was obviously black and the bad guys on Satan's payroll. So they'd play this disorienting music and a song that was about we won't be hard on you, and then show us covers of the music that said you're observing us. Well, we're called AI mirror script. And another picture on one of these music albums had a black car that was driving away because we were always being taken away in black cars, and it said Tell America on it. And back then people had no idea about like pedivores or how bad it really was. But we knew that later on, some point, we'd eventually be able to tell America. So then there was other areas of this whole complex. There was a mill area, mill feed, more junkyards, cement yards, lots of buried evidence and disposal points in this place. We were very stressed running around here. Sometimes we would get to sit in a gazebo outside of one of these places, and then we were actually like fully conscious, fully in control of ourselves. And this gazebo was built on a cross-shaped sidewalk that had a circle around it, like the shape of a white cross with a circle around it. So we liked this energy. We could run around it and then counter the energy of the black cross that was running through town everywhere that they had set up. And there was flowers, and it was lovely to sit on. So what they did is that they eventually just tore down the whole gazebo, anything that we liked or felt tent in. So then we would write graffiti on things and write like "Be nice" on their company's sign or whatnot. Then there was an axe throwing house not too far from this other area where the Deadpool character was forged. Red's crew had a lot of different operations, a lot of different people. Many blocks were just very cursed, like a mafia ring that you needed permission to even like walk past these houses or buildings that had offices in them and permission to talk to people. Certain stone mark, a lot of trepidations over train tracks and other areas, creeping over every corner, nook, and cranny, like an old district. But a lot of these places were just full of rotting spiritual decay, and you could see like the black mold and the same green like black mold just like lingering into the stone edifices of many of these places until they're just either burnt down or they collapse in on themselves. They're just kind of like an eyesore when you walk past them. We were brought to a barn where old vets hung out. And then there was also a schoolhouse in this area where another one of the black crosses that said Giants on it were at.